right, everyone, welcome back. I'm chatting with Barr Moses, co-founder and CEO of Monte Carlo, and we're chatting data, data downtime, and data observability, amongst other things. And where we left off was Barr was just pointing out how engineering had all of these great tools around observability, monitoring, and being able to know what's going on with our data, and data hasn't, and it's an industry-wide problem. And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot too, coming from an engineering background, operating a lot of sites, which is if you look at infrastructure, SRE, DevOps teams, especially modern teams, there's a lot of work put into observability, into defining SLOs and SLIs, into being able to understand exactly what's happening all the time with your systems, being able to respond to them quickly. And in my mind, I also look at it as like there's a lot of parallels to where data is now, and perhaps where the engineering industry was, 5, 6, 7 years ago, as we started, working on a lot of these tools. But then there's also some different challenges. So I'd love to hear some of your perspective on what are some of the similarities where we can take some of what engineering's done and kind of carry it over, and then what are some of the unique challenges to data?
Yeah, I think there's definitely, sufficient similarities for us to learn from and to adapt. And I think if we, as an industry navigate this, it's sort of on us to figure out what are the corollaries that we can really work through and that can be beneficial to us, and where are the areas of friction where, like this just doesn't work for data, things are different, and we discard that. And so, when you sort of take a step back, you think about like, how do we get to this point, right? Why is data actually at this point? I think there's a big shift that data that we've seen in data. Maybe 5 to 10 years ago, maybe 4 to 5 years ago, even data was used by a very small handful of people in the organization. And it was really siloed to often a side project, something that was like spun out of IT or maybe, sort of finance. And really was sort of kind of a defensive mechanism to make sure that you sort of understand your business, kind of the, what's our ARR, how many customers do we have? And then, fast forward to today's reality is very different, right? Companies or organizations and companies are demanding real-time answers. You might have 3, 4, 5, 10 different data warehouses, similar amount of BI solutions, like the analytics team wants one BI, the engineering needs a different, finance wants a third, it's very common to see companies with a wide variety of different systems. And so when you think about what the challenges are being posed by a system like that, everything shifts, right? So data is no longer centralized, it's actually distributed. And yet the ways in which we're managing data are historically have been centralized. And so that's just as an example. And so we need to rethink how we're managing our data architecture, how we're sort of addressing all these questions like reliability and security and access. And so one of the areas that I'm personally passionate about is like, how do we make data self-serve, and what does that actually mean? And a lot of sort of the best practices or sort of methodologies that were developed in software engineering, for example, data observability or sort of the concepts in DevOps, we can actually adopt them and use them and sort of take them to the world of data.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's something that, we started working together, the Zebra and Monte Carlo, because that's something that we've been looking at as well, right? Which is, how do we build an organization where, where we're supporting the rest of the org, right? And building the tools that we can use so that it's not a constant question, like to get back to where we started, right? There's always this question, you always come in, no one knows, the data team's the last to know. How do we flip that around? How do we make it such that the data team is the first to know? That there's an analogy, and I can't remember if I mentioned this in one of my previous episodes, I may have, that a friend and mentor of mine gave or like asked, which is, why do cars have brakes? And the answer is not to slow down, it's actually so you can go fast, right? And so his question was, when it comes to technology, we're talking about engineering, what are the brakes on your car, right? And when you look at engineering infrastructure, some of the brakes are being able to do push button deploys and push button rollbacks, right, cleanly. But then how do you know when you need to do that? You need the sensors, the monitors to understand what's going on. Did my deploy work? Can I roll it back quickly, right? And so all of this is around not just the brakes, but the instrumentation in the car to understand what's going on. There are some parts where it's harder to know. How do you know when you roll something out when maybe some numbers have shifted by a 0.5%, right? Like what is broken in data? Like, and how do you get to that? How do you understand that? Where in engineering, sometimes it might just be the page loads or it doesn't, or this functions or it doesn't, right? Like, so I'm being a little bit like kind of hand wavy there, right? Because there is more subtlety on the engineering side, but I'm just curious, how you look at the differences in understanding whether it's working or not.
Yeah, I'll continue your hand wavy metaphor here with the car, and I'll give you how I think about the car metaphor too. I think to a certain degree, the way that we've been doing things with data so far is, if you imagine sort of a car manufacturing, actually, where you sort of take kind of everything that it takes into building a car, like glass and sand and metal or whatever, and then you sort of start building and start assembling the car, and sort of different stations and different transformations. And then at the end, you get a car, and then you're going to take it to a test drive. And when you're sort of driving at like full speed on the highway, that's actually when you find out that everything is wrong. And that's sort of what we're doing with data today. What if we actually had sort of monitoring and instrumentation and testing throughout the system, not just in one point at the end or at the start, but actually throughout it. So you can have that sort of end-to-end view and understand the different failure points.
No, that's fantastic. And that's where I get back to, I from an engineering standpoint, was always a huge advocate of the right amount of testing, unit testing, integration testing, but we haven't done that on the data side. And I think partially because data hasn't always had an engineering influence, right? Like a lot of times it had a math or a stats influence. And we need to combine both of them, right? We need to take a lot of those methodologies, but then enhance new ones, right? So maybe we need to figure out, maybe things like anomaly detection are actually very important early on. They're not like later down the cycle, but we need to actually understand, like, where are the small variances, because it isn't as binary as it's working or not.
Yeah, for sure. And I think sort of the moving upstream of that is an important part, right? Maybe anomaly detection has to happen earlier. Another example of that is actually changes to your API or third-party data, or schema changes that happen sort of upstream. Those are important things that, as sort of the data team, you might not be aware of someone upstream making a change on the engineering team, but you need to be aware of that if you're sort of responsible for the quality of that data. And that's an example of something that's like actually often overlooked and is one of the biggest culprits of sort of data downtime.
We're dealing with that right now. And actually,
oh, really?
it's something where I'm gonna, this little portion right here, I want to end with maybe a loaded question, which is, who owns data quality?
When I worked at Gainsight and we were sort of creating the customer success category, the big question was, who's owning the customer, right? Who owns the customer? Is it customer success? Is it, sales, who sort of initially kind of sells to the customer? Is it support, customer success, serving the customer? Is it product and engineering, who's building? Who is it, right? And to a certain degree, the answer was always, it's actually everyone, right?
Yep.
Everyone in the company is responsible. And I think similarly in data, everyone likes to blame and points and maybe someone else, it's not really me, like that person built that pipeline, I have nothing to do with that. But I actually think it's everyone's responsibility, and it's
I couldn't agree more. Like, I think this is one of those things where it is different for organizations because it is a broad system and it touches every aspect, and everyone does own data quality to varying extents. And in my opinion, the job of the data team is to provide everyone with the ability to own their parts of data quality, to understand what's happening, to take action on it. That's the job of the data team, right? Is to provide those tools and that visibility and that technology that they need to do their jobs.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think it sort of kind of brings the question of what's the right organizational structure to support something like that. But I very much view sort of the data team's role in sort of selecting the right guidelines or tools or processes that actually enable everyone else to own data quality, data trust, but also data access, data security, et cetera.